All right, so the inspection process, we talked about that there is an enforcement and compliance. The inspectors actually have what's called police power. Do you understand what that means when we say police power? They have the right to come in and shut you down. And it's just like if a policeman comes up, an officer that we normally think of with a badge and a gun, and he says, pull over, stop, I'm going to write you a ticket and you have to obey them. Inspectors have that same police power where they can say, stop, you can't go forward, and you have to comply. You can build a home, and if you do something after the final inspection and the CO, like some railing that you changed that doesn't meet code, et cetera, and they find out about it, they can go to that home at any reasonable hour, whatever reasonable hour means, and that's probably from sunup to sundown, and can ask to come in the home and look at it. And if you've participated, and that's why I always told builders that if someone asks you to do something after the inspector leaves that would make something non-code compliant, don't participate in it, because you're now liable if you participate. So if you put the ratings in, inspector comes and passes them off, he leaves, and now you change the rating out to something that doesn't meet code, and you personally do it or approve it or are involved in it, then now you have liability for that. But they have that police power. Now they can't abuse it. Sometimes we feel like they do, but I'm sure that sometimes they feel like we abuse them. So again, it's a two-way street. How many of you know what an ES report is? By a show of hands. You've heard that term, ICC ES report. This is pretty typical of a group this size. Usually I'll have less than 1% that have even heard of that term. And so I want to spend some time, and we'll talk specifically about the ICC ES. And ICC stands for International Code Council, we understand that. And ES stands for Evaluation Service Report, or an ESR, and legacy reports. So what happens is it will look like this. There will be a number up at the top right, an ESR with a number. It'll talk about reissue on a date. You can see this one says reissue October 1, 2011. This is just an example I'm giving you. It's a masonry, it's a manufactured stone. It's for Harris stone. We're all familiar with Harris stone. It's a popular product, especially here in this region. It's based out of Ogden, Utah. They literally ship stone around the world, and particularly the western United States and Intermountain region. They're one of those products. Remember I talked about being codifiable? They're a product that isn't specifically detailed in the code book for their product. So in order to be codifiable, they go through a process, and the ICC has this service where they'll be evaluated for how it's installed in order to meet code and safety, what kind of substrates it can be put on, what's best practices for moisture drainage, et cetera, et cetera. Typically these reports are about 2 pages. Some are 1, some are 3, but most of them are no more than 2 pages. And they get reissued on a regular basis. And so if it says legacy report, that means it was pre-2000. You had multiple codes back then, ICBO, so on and so forth. And those codes all came together in 1996 and then came upon the ICCs as we now understand them. And most municipalities around the country and even around the world use, or at least base their codes on the ICC. California, for instance, has a layer above, one step above if you ever build in California. They've taken the ICC codes, placed them on steroids, and that's where they're at. And that's okay for their earthquake standards and other things like that. They obviously, some of those things are very valid, and they choose to do that. But this is where you would go for information. So for instance, Mike, if I'm going to spec out Harris stone on a house, and I'm going to make sure that John and Chantel have drawn it, and that's the specification, and it's all part of that, I want to make sure that Brad and his team have had this and read it. They understand how that needs to get installed. I'd also make sure that whoever I'm allowing to be on the job to install that also has that and understands it. There are some cities that before you do stucco will require that the ES report is turned in with the plan for plan check, and that it be on the job site when they do the lath inspection, because if they don't have this, they don't know if they're meeting code. Not all cities require that specific inspection, but again, it's an ESR report or an ES report. Most builders don't have copies of these. They rely on their subcontractors. My advice is every product you use, know that it has an ESR report and have it on file, and make sure your production staff have read it. It doesn't take a long time, but it gives you great information and you'll avoid a ton of defects. You can go online and find these. They're very, very easy to find. And they always get updated. If they don't get updated, there's a problem with the company, I can guarantee you, and you want to go to a different product. We're going to talk about mold for a minute. Everyone ever deal with mold in a home? I fought an inspector on a mold issue. He told me I had to put a vapor barrier in. I said, if I put a vapor barrier in this location, in this climate, in this situation, I will have mold. I had mold before the buyer moved in, and we had to tear it out and redo it. And I was able to get some documentation. But mold used to be a really big issue, and mainly because the homes were getting tighter and tighter. In the building industry prior to the 1970s, we just didn't have mold. We had windy, drafty houses, and there was so much, and the only place you had mold was in showers, bathroom areas predominantly, as a rule of thumb, or a leak that had been going on for years and years behind a wall that you just didn't know about. Then with the energy crisis of the 70s, we tightened down those structures and became a little bit more energy efficient. Homes started to have insulation for the first time. My first home didn't have insulation in the walls, folks. Wasn't required. Didn't need it. Boy, what we didn't know. I can guarantee you when we changed and the cost of energy went skyrocketing and the energy codes changed, all of a sudden there are all kinds of programs to get your walls insulated, and we insulated our walls. Made a huge difference, by the way. It was great, you know. What we didn't know. And now we've gone through that again, where our energy codes are changing about every 3 years or so, and we're tightening down the envelope. We have very little air movement. So now if you have water, you've got a major issue. Or if you have a cold surface where the vapor is transferring through, it's going to condensate when it hits that cold vapor, so that cold barrier. So you've got to make sure that you understand how your walls are being made and the climate in which you're in, because you're going to have a problem with mold if you don't. It's a defect, and this is important to understand. Mold, and that's why I bring it up, because mold kind of gets thrown under the carpet these days, but it still can be a problem. But it's only a defect when it's a design problem, so remember that. It's a material defect, or it's an insulation error. It has to meet one of those three criteria for mold to be considered a defect. If it's not a defect, no insurance today that I'm aware of covers it, period. So that's important, especially from your homeowners, and then a combination of those, of course. Now, sometimes it's the lifestyle. Probably 75% or so, maybe a little less. When I'm called out onto a project to look at what is perceived to be a mold problem, it's a lifestyle. And you can track that lifestyle and figure out there's not proper ventilation. Again, the houses are closed up more than they used to be. Maybe the homeowner does a lot of steamed food, steamed vegetables or whatever, and they do a lot of steaming in their kitchen, and they have a very low-grade hood, a vent hood, and it just won't ventilate out. Or they have showers and bathrooms that don't have windows, and they have fans and they don't run the fans. That's another common problem. And you'll get, condensation on those windows, and then you'll start getting some mold growing over time if it's just a consistent problem. I've got people who will not open up their windows and they will not turn on their fans, and then they wonder why the windows are wet and why they've got mold. And mold will grow, and we're not going to talk about that, I don't think, but mold will grow on any surface, by the way. And mold's an interesting. Do you know what it takes for mold to grow? Three elements that it takes for mold to grow. Moisture, food. What else? Say again?
Warm.
Warm? Doesn't have to. Warm usually precipitates a faster growth pattern, and certain molds will grow exponentially in warm, humid climates. And so warm can be an issue. But it just needs a surface to grow on, a food source, and moisture. So can we control a surface in a building? Absolutely not. We have so many surfaces in a building. How do we stop that? Can we control food? What does mold eat? What causes it to grow? It lives on organic material. Our houses are built out of organic material. Everything we cut, saw, chop, or otherwise in the field leaves some residue. So we can't control those two. So moisture then is the only thing we can control. And if you can control moisture, there will never be mold, period. So fortunately, And these are the drivers for defect litigation. If you're going to get sued for a defect, and I'm basing this on my experience here in the Intermountain region, and it has changed recently. Up until a couple of years ago, settlement of underlying soils was number 2. It's now number 1. We can talk about that if you'd like. Water intrusion, flashings, and barriers, that was number 1. It's now slightly lower. We get a lot of those, or a combination of those two, for most litigation. Improper stucco systems, that's unfortunately fairly high up the list. Severe cracking in foundations, concrete, and drywall. And typically this is related to one of those two or both. Typically this is related to those two. Rarely do you see them alone. If you don't have one of these going on, usually there could be a problem there, but it doesn't manifest itself as readily. Now, this is another key takeaway. If you've got a problem, remember we talked about jumping on it immediately and just taking care of the problem. If you've got an issue in the job site, I mean, we have contracts that say our homeowners can't go on the job site without a member of the team. Does that work? No. In fact, I always joke that usually the homeowner's there more often than the superintendent is. And so if you really want to know what's going on with the job or didn't go on with the job that day, don't call the superintendent, call the homeowner. Now we joke about that, but there's some truth to it. And our homeowners, if we're building a home for them, love the process. So I recommend you include them in it and find a way to make it a pleasant experience and not an adversarial one. But they will know when something's not right. And if they are the ones that call you, you've got a problem. And if you've got a problem, it's whether you do email or have a post on a website where you have a communication with your homeowner, make sure you're talking about the things that are going well and the things that need fixing, because if you're telling them about them, it's called open dialogue or transparency, and they love it. If they find out that something's wrong, you better fix it really, really quick, because if not, they're going to start looking. And I can guarantee you, once they are in the looking mode, they're going to be nitpicky, and you're going to have just an awful experience with them. So it's critical, and they will find more issues. It's just like the inspectors. Leave something for them to find, and they will find something else. I guarantee it. So jump on it quickly and take care of it. It is a fact. Okay, next slide. 4 types of construction defects. There are some in the industry that believe there are only 3. Myself and several other colleagues really believe there are 4. So just trust me on this one. And we're going to talk about 4, and I think when we're done you'll agree with me. The first one is construction document defects. Well, what's a construction document? What's part of what, when I say a construction document, what does that mean to us? Site plan. Say again louder.
Site plan,
engineering, truss specs, the plans, specifications, ES reports. We talked about that, didn't we? All of that. The contracts, your scopes of work, everything that has to do on paper with building this home, whether it's electronic version or hard copy, is part of this construction document package. If there's a lawsuit, that's the first thing I ask for. I want to see all the documentation. I want to see the plans, the specifications, the engineering report, the soils report, on and on and on and on, because it's all going to play into who has responsibility. And of course, if I don't have good details here, that's problematic, and that's what makes it one of the defects. The experts like myself who don't think that this is a defect actually really believe it is. They just don't count it because they say, well, the attorneys deal with the contract side of things. Still a defect, regardless of whether they deal with it or not. But I deal with the specification part of it, and so it is part of the 4 that I use. Design defects. Now, in terms of which ones happen more often, you'll see readily as we go through the presentation today that there's a trend, but they do all take place. Material defects is one of those that does happen. Not very often. I've only seen it a couple of times, but it can and will happen. How many of you have ever had a car break, a part fail early, and you take it in? That's a defect, and they replace it. And we have the same thing happening in the home industry. Sometimes things just break. You ever have a faucet break, a couple months after the home was built? Sure, it happens. Mine did. 3 months after I moved into my gorgeous custom home, my faucet broke. Fix it, it's good as new. And so you occasionally have material defects on a project, but not very often. We just don't see many. Installation defects. Now, I've got them in order of what happens, but in reality, this sometimes is ahead of that or part of that. But this is always the last one, and by far and away, it is huge. But let's just quickly go through the documents. We talked about the site plan, the construction drawings, that was on your list. Specific drawings of details, you mentioned that. The specifications, those are all a part of that. But they all should include manufacturer specifications. This is one area we don't see much of. It should have your scopes of work. That's part of that package. Some of you don't use scopes of works. Some of you do. It's important to use those in terms of keeping things in sequence, especially when you're building a lot. Contracts, which would be primary contracts, that's with you and the client. Secondary would be with trade partners and vendors.